history. Oops, so here we go.
Sorry about that. That was abrupt. Let me, we
No,
need to,
don't
yeah.
worry.
All right. I'm gonna
Are we
go.
starting?
Not quite. We're almost there. And we
Okay,
are good to go. We are live on our YouTube now. So go ahead.
we're live. Welcome, everyone, to this panel on translation and archipelagic translations is one way to put it. I'm looking for our exact title. One of us, Translation and Archipelagic Thought, American Solidarities and Melting Points. I'm Susan Gilman, and I am the chair of this panel. We're delighted to have all of you, even if we can't see you. And here's how we're planning to proceed with our panel. We are a reduced crew of 4, including me, who's not planning on speaking, other than informally. So we're down to 4, including me, rather than 6. So we've got a little bit more time, which we're glad for, and that's really will help you, our audience. You you are the YouTubers. Um, we are the live streamers. You will, with any questions or comments at all, put them in your chat, and then our wonderful tech person, Erwin, will put those in the chat for us, and we'll monitor those. We also have in the chat, I don't know if we can send it to you guys, but never mind. And our remaining 3 panelists, Brian Roberts, Brian Russell Roberts, Evan Espiritu, is that correct? Gandhi? Beautiful name. And Adrian de Leon will each speak for about 15 to 20 minutes each. And then we will open up the virtual floor to your questions and comments. And we have had, Brian and I together have done this kind of online format before, and it's been very successful, much more fertile than you might think. So if past is prologue or really more like an index or an indicator, we should be in good shape. So there we go. Let me just give you brief bios of each of our speakers before we begin, and then we will go in order of the program, which will be Brian, Adrian, and then, is that right, Brian, Adrian, and Evan? Yes? Okay. Brian Roberts is Professor of English and Humanities College Professor at Brigham Young University. He has 2 books that are very related to what the panel is doing, and those are one co-edited essay collection with Michelle Stevens called Archipelagic American Studies, Duke University Press, 2017, and his own book, single-authored Border Waters, Amid the Archipelagic States of America, Duke, 2021. Our second speaker, so will be, again, is it Adrian next? That's what I thought. Okay. Will be Adrian de Leon, who is an assistant professor of history at NYU. Is that correct? Thank you. And we want to congratulate Adrian. This is his, he has just changed his job to assistant professor of history at NYU. Congratulations, Adrian, for that move. He is the author of Bundak, a hinterland history of Filipino America. University of North Carolina Press just came out now, and he is reputedly on a book tour. So congratulations, Adrian. Yes, we're very excited for you. And he also is the author of a collection of poems. I just wanted to mention this because our creative, critical, public-facing scholarship is important to all of us. And I think of this as one of those. It's called Barangay, an offshore poem, again, a watery part of what we're doing, Buck Writer Books 2021. And then our last panelist is Evan Gandhi. She is just recently promoted to associate professor of Asian American Studies at UCLA. Another one who's due congratulations. She also has a new baby. Congratulations, Evan. We're all impressed with the coalescing of those life events. She is the author of another book where archipelago is in the title, Archipelago of Resettlement, Vietnamese Refugee Settlers and Decolonization Across Guam and Israel-Palestine, published open access by the University of California Press in April 2022. I'm thrilled to be a part of this panel, and let me hand it over to Brian, who has told us he's a little bit under the weather.
That's right. Thanks, Susan. Yes, as I was telling my co-panelists, I am a little under the weather in that I have a cold, and so I apologize if I, at some point during my 15 to 20-minute presentation, need to just duck out via mute and out of the video stream, but I will be back shortly after the coughing has subsided. I do want to start out by expressing deep gratitude to Evan for co-organizing this session with me and being really the point person for this session as I was organizing the ASA International Committee's Archipelagic Pedagogy session for the in-person ASA convention in November. And as I've been researching and writing on archipelagic translation, I very much admired Evan's work on this topic, as the phrase archipelagic translation appears as the final heading in the third chapter of Archipelagoes of Resettlement, which Susan mentioned came out in 2022. And under this heading, I was very interested to see how Evan places a kind of translation that is not polished and not well planned, but rough and ad hoc. Rough because it's run ragged, and ad hoc because it relies on chance encounters among translators, target languages, and source languages. It's a conceptualization that I admire, and it also has a certain resonance with the decentralized and improvisatory ASA convention this year, as its sessions span from November to December of 2023, and then into March of 2024. And gratitude to Chris Schell, who's not here, and Erwin Mendoza, who is here, for helping make things happen on the fly like this. I'm also indebted, of course, to Susan Gilman, who's chairing this session and whom I've also been collaborating with on a larger project on archipelagic translation, an in-progress edited collection tentatively titled Translate Like an Archipelago, Archipelagic Thinking and Translation in the Americas. And my presentation today has three main parts. First, it orients the session's keywords, archipelago and translation, in relation to the ASA convention theme. Second, it reflects on a set of fundamentally convergent metaphors between the notion of archipelago and the notion of translation. And third, it discusses the question of Nusantara, which is an Indonesian archipelagic term. So part one. Aligned with the ASA 2023 convention theme of solidarity, this panel examines two realms of solidarity making, translation and archipelagic thinking. Now, translation has been a mode of solidarity making to the degree that it has constructed bridges, no matter how contingent or tenuous, between languages and cultures. Meanwhile, archipelagic thinking has also attuned itself to the question of solidarity or connection among different islands, as, for instance, the Cuban theorist Antonio Benitez Rojo, in The Repeating Island, out in English translation in 1996, has described the very character of the archipelago as a, quote, discontinuous conjunction. These two realms of solidarity building have not remained neatly in their separate spheres. In fact, the Martinican philosopher Edward Glissant has viewed translation and archipelagic thinking as interdependent, co-constitutive, and existing in solidarity with each other. In his Introduction to a Poetics of Diversity, out in 1996, Glissant posits a crucial intersection between the project of translation and the practice of archipelagic thought. He argues that translation involves an acceptance that, quote, somewhere else's truth fixates on our truth here, end quote. He frames translation as fundamental to, quote, our ever multiplying world of roaming dizziness. Thus, he writes, translation is among the elements most essential to this new mode of archipelagic thought. Now, in considering the archipelagic Americas and American connected archipelagos beyond the Americas, what could it mean in ways that may exceed Glissant's own thinking to suggest that translation and archipelagic thought are or may exist in solidarity as intertwined, interdependent, and even co-constitutive practices? For translators and translation studies scholars, what could it mean to take the ocean-island complex of the archipelago as a methodological template? For scholars of archipelagic thinking, which has emanated from numerous archipelagic regions across the planet, what could it mean to take translation as a structuring metaphor for how we understand the ontologies of the archipelago and how we understand the epistemologies that the archipelago makes possible? Beyond structuring metaphors and methodological templates, what other and perhaps unforecasted solidarities might arise between archipelagic thinking and translation? And of course, sorry, and thanks for your patience. And of course, when and how do such solidarities fall apart, arriving at melting points beyond which solidness is no longer useful or desired? Part 2. When most English speakers hear the verb to translate, we think of the task of converting one language to another. Unsurprisingly, this is the Oxford English Dictionary's first definition for the term. And the OED expounds on this initial definition, saying, quote, to convert or render a word, a work, an author, a language, etc., into another language, to express or convey the meaning of a word or text using equivalent words in a different language. Now, this all feels like common sense, but scroll down in the OED's discussion, and another less prominent definition than the first presents itself. Quote, let's see, where was I? Quote, to convey or move a person or thing from one place to another, to transfer or transport a person or thing, to exile or deport a person or thing. Juxtaposing these two definitions of the English verb to translate is a reminder that the notion of translation has traditionally hinged on mobility, on movement, or the idea of movement from one place to another. That which is moving or that which is being moved may be a person, place, thing, or a person, thing, sentence, or poem. And the sites from which and to which it is being moved may be a material place or language tradition. Translation's imbrication with mobility comes as no surprise to German speakers who speak a language in which the standard translational equivalent for the verb to translate is übersetzen, which might be paraphrased in English as an act of taking something and moving it or setting it in a new place. Translation is movement, and when we talk about translation from one language to another, we are also talking about movement. Although the overtly and self-consciously kinetic definition of translation is to a large degree overlooked in everyday speech, language translation as movement from one place to another is a founding structural metaphor among translators and scholars who have thought about translation. We see this in many places. For instance, in the introduction to the Oxford University Press anthology, Translation, Theory and Practice from 2006, the editors offer a definition in which translation is a project of, quote, building linguistic bridges across the channels that divide language spheres and cultural regions. Elsewhere, Ken Liu, in his translator's postscript to Liu Cixin's Hugo Award-winning science fiction novel, The Three-Body Problem, out in 2006 in Chinese and in English translation in 2014, writes, quote, the act of translation involves breaking down one piece of work in one language and ferrying the pieces across a gulf to reconstitute them in a new work in another language. The gulf separating the two is as wide as the Pacific Ocean that separates China from America, and the task can be daunting. Still elsewhere, we see John Alba Cutler's discussion at the beginning of his book, Ends of Assimilation, the Formation of Chicano Literature in 2015, of Lorna D. Cervantes's dual language poem, The Refugee Ship or Barco Refugiado. In this poem, as Cutler observes, the Chicana poet regrets that she cannot communicate with her own grandmother in Spanish, finding herself confined to a refugee ship that never docks in either language, English or Spanish. All of these figurations tie the prominent linguistic definition of translation closely to the less prominent kinetic definition. And in so doing, each is highly consistent with what translation studies scholar translation studies scholar Christina Schaffner has commented on as the standard metaphors that cast translation as bridge building, ferrying, or carrying across. Thus, even as the conventional relation between translation and movement is reaffirmed, the rehearsal of these figurations is also a reminder that the notion of mobility that has undergirded the notion of translation has itself been undergirded by the notion of water. Channels, gulfs, oceans, and seas over which the ferries and ships and rafts and bridges of translation navigate in variously favorable, daunting, and undockable conditions. Hence, the project of translation carries a certain cargo, that of mobility across waters, from one place to another. Indeed, the act of translating, as conceived via some of its most foundational and structuring metaphors, depends on and locates itself within an archipelagic grammar, a grammar that corresponds to an archipelagic mode of thought. This mode of thought, which from ancient times to the present has taken relationalities among islands, oceans, seas, island chains, coasts, and bays as objects, subjects, and templates for thinking, acting, and being in the world. Reciprocally, the grammar of over-water transit that resides within the fundamentals of translational thinking comes to resemble some of the archipelagic relationalities discussed in the introduction to the 2017 edited volume, Archipelagic American Studies. As archipelagic connections proliferate among nodes and across a sea of islands, with these connections emerging as filamentous networks, simultaneously evocative of airline routes, communication cables, kinship ties, internet connections, social networks, and waka or canoe voyages. In contemplating translation's relevance to and place within such archipelagic networks, it is necessary to take seriously the convergence between translation's self-conscious preoccupation with meaning conveyance and the archipelago's relation to meaning making, as intimated by Yolanda Martinez San Miguel and Michelle Stevens in their book, Contemporary Archipelagic Thinking. Quote, the archipelago calls for a meaning-making and rearticulation that responds to human experiences traversing space and time. In other words, the archipelago, whose discontinuous conjunctions of oceans and shorelines has already been a structuring metaphor for thinking about the kinetics of translation, is a thought template and material geography that specifically calls for the cross-cultural meaning-making to which the theory and practice of translation is dedicated. Such convergences between the materiality of archipelagic space and questions of translation's metaphors of movement and water have received relatively little sustained attention. And yet these convergences make it absolutely clear that scholars interested in the nexus of mobility and archipelagic thinking need to give attention to the topic of and practice of translation. And reciprocally, to the degree that translators and translation studies scholars have only very infrequently thought of their implicitly archipelagic metaphors in self-consciously archipelagic ways, we also see that classic and recent innovations in archipelagic thinking stand to shed new light on the question, mechanics, ends, and means of translation. Okay, I've made it to part 3, only needing to stop to cough for about 9 times. And here we go with part 3. When Richard Wright went to Indonesia in 1955 to attend the Anti-Colonial Asian African Conference in Bandung, his host was the prominent Indonesian novelist and newspaper editor Mokhtar Lubis. Shortly after Wright's visit, Mokhtar was working on a novel titled Senja di Jakarta, or as it was published in English translation in 1963, Twilight in Jakarta. This novel, which had its first publication in English and was also the first Indonesian novel to be translated into English, deserves more attention than I am able to give it here today. Today, I simply want to mention not a scene, but a setting of a scene. Near a Jakarta street called Nusantara Street in the 1963 English translation, or Jalan Nusantara if you were in Indonesia. The meaning of this street's name isn't conveyed in English, since the word Nusantara is not translated in the English translation. But it references an old Javanese word describing what has come to be the Indonesian archipelago, and it has developed this word Nusantara via the Indonesian state into the notion of wawasan Nusantara, often translated as archipelagic outlook, which takes the sea tidak lagi sebagai pemisah tetapi sebagai penghubung, or not as a divider, but as something that links. Nusantara is a concept in spatiality that I have elsewhere discussed as a type of border water, and it is aligned with Epelihaofa's protestations against continental men who have drawn imaginary lines across the sea. Further, it is aligned with Edward Glissant's commentary in his 2009 Philosophy of Relation that, quote, borders between places that are constituted by archipelagos do not assume the form of walls, but rather of passages, of pathways. So, some concluding questions. What happens to translation when we take the difference between Indonesian and English, or French and Spanish, not as a linguistic border, but as a linguistic door? Not as the difference that is a divider, but as something that ineluctably links, not as a wall, but as a passageway or pathway. And what happens to archipelagic thinking when we look at the waters and re-envision them with their ripples, waves, tides, tsunamis, and sea level changes? When we re-envision them as oceans of ceaseless translation between land and sea and sea, and land. These questions radically remap our understanding of both translation and archipelagic thinking, and they are fundamental to this session and our multi-scholar project of archipelagic translation. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, for that valiant. You never gave up. Next is Adrian.
I'm going to begin with 4 poems from my 2021 collection, Barangay, an offshore poem. And I begin with these actually because I think, Brian, your comments on the spatiality of translation nicely segues into the creative project that I sought out to do. So the first poem in the 4 I'm going to read is called Barangay, noun, a preamble. Venus, kanabangka, hold us when the ocean stings your limbs. Can those sails steer us past the breach when Clotilda billows you around like shrouds? Will these outriggers keep us afloat when slavers ledger your dead weight? Can we cradle skin against resplendent skin when Guinea man gut an umbilical past? Will we paddle ashore a stolen land? For the archipelagoes, next poem. From Kiribati to Castries, from Luzon to Lanai, from Ainu Musir to Aotearoa, from Tawi-Tawi to Tonga, from Singapore to Scarborough. What tempest strands us on the disappearing shores? After Edgar Glissant. Next one is one of my wake poems. In the sailor sea, our clock flickers from the wake. When a blaze breaks the lavender, we call the embers morning. A wrestle between desperate ray and relentless cloud, we name their romp the afternoon. If amber blinds the retina, we bid goodnight to the sun. If ice seems to shimmer in waves as above, we greet the night. The stern germinates into the earth, branching timelines like cedars evergreening into the shore. Can we burn the water's waxy leaves into necessary medicine? Will we breathe its smoke until our memory scars over? Or will our time be denied from us until the shoal beds the dead into the grains of an hourglass? Dung Ao, which is an Ilocano morning chant, and there are several of these poems throughout. This mortuary marooned into decimals, a last glimpse of persons about to disappear into the hold. To these halls, professional gatekeepers, each body corresponds to a line in the catalog, each rib a folder among the femurs plundered from the hearth, what bones wreck beneath. Spine against spine, shelved on ancient wood and guarded marble, I saw a grave, but no epitaphs except ethnologies, no lifespans listed except the date of acquisition. Here is the shoreline of the famished cemetery. Here are the waves of the slaughterhouse. Here are archives in our stars. I want to read one more. It's another wake poem. Once barangay sighed along the Pasig where reeds shook in the wake, where shanty shores now stilt, wet stone bolos waded through billowing fish. Once Pasig churched from the same gasps that stretched these sails. Once mga tala pooled to sweep us here. I begin with barangay to talk about to introduce today's presentation, which I'm calling The Cacophony of Filipino Diaspora, an Archipelagic Critique, that I think really blends in nicely from Brian's talk right before. So if you look at any really any tourist brochure, any sort of copy that advertises Philippine tourism, you might note that it's it's got its sort of cliches, right? Like 7,000 islands, hundreds of languages, right? With two hegemonic languages, right? English and Filipino. And Filipino, like Bahasa Indonesia, Bahasa Melayu, is like an artificial derivation of Tagalog that becomes scaled up to become this sort of aspirational national language, right? And Vicente Rafael, one of my mentors, has long argued that Tagalogs and Englishes, many Tagalogs and Englishes and Taglishes proliferate even within the dense yet contained spaces of Metro Manila. And yet the world certainly hears the Filipino subject in English, especially through the affective labor extracted via the Filipino voice and our uncanny rendition of the American dialect in the English language, right? This comes in through a lot of the work done by, for example, anthropologist Jan Padillos on call centers, or Christine Bacareza Balance on Filipino rock and roll, or Karen Thompson on karaoke, right? But why do our epistemic approaches to the Philippines and the Filipino diaspora, particularly in American studies, rarely account for really what is the archipelago of this constitutive heteroglossia that the Philippines really is, right? Why is approaching the Philippines in this interdisciplinary formation known as American studies something that can't seem to ally the nation state, the monolingualisms of the Philippine national self and area studies as colonial other, or one that chants in unison with the frequency of nationalism? So an archipelagic critique, in the way that I both teach it and also deploy it in my series of works, I find not the internationalism into which the failed promises of transnational turns retreated. Rather, I find a perspective in a project that aims to decenter the colonial forms of relation or anti-relation we've inherited in the way that imperial geographies have partitioned the world. It is first a denaturing of the geospatial imaginaries we have inherited after the global reorientation of imperialism into the nation state through a grounding of the contestations over space and the movement between them. I'm thinking here, for example, from the archipelago of carceral islands in occupied Palestine, Evan, your work, right, to the anti-colonial solidarities to undermine the military archipelago of the Trans-Pacific Military Garrison of the United States, to the unruly archipelagos that are called variously, and I might add pathetically, the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea, right? Like in what ways are oceanic archipelagic maritime spaces subjected to territorial claims, and what ways do our epistemes actually come into to fill in, right, and do that sort of project of the nation state itself, right? And second, this critique, archipelagic critique, I might note, is an attunement to dispersals and incommensurabilities at multiple registers of capital, of people, of power, of ideas, of language, in whose transits we might find what Bruce Cummings might call a parallax vision. And if paraphrasing Jean-Luc Nancy, if a community is something that compares together a plurality of subjects who touch but not meld, whose I is constituted through both the you and I comparing simultaneously, then the Filipino diaspora, quote, as a community, if we might dare call so, is likewise best understood as an archipelago of disparate and cacophonous languages and peoples, gathered together into a chain of island peoples whose only glue is 400 years of decolonizing revolutions. So in Barangay, in my 2021 collection, which I conceptualize as the first installment of a long-term trilogy that really deploys an archipelagic critique of Filipino diaspora, but not necessarily in the sort of geospatial expectations that we might think of an archipelagic critique. I really wanted to imagine what a poetics, and this is working off of the Glissantian sort of notion, what a poetics of Filipino diaspora looked like that lived and was comfortable in sitting in the discomfort of that heteroglossia. For example, right? What might it mean, for example, to write poems in all 4 languages that I speak, or all 5 languages that I speak? The 4 languages in the book being English, Spanish, Tagalog, and Ilocano. What might it mean to reckon with the heteroglossia of the archive itself, the cacophony of the archive itself, and the cacophony that constitutes really the disparate visions of what we come to know as Philippine nationalism, right? And for anyone who has the book, the third section, Tributaries, was originally called, funny enough, Translations. And it was prose poems, short prose poems on the politics of why I refuse to translate. I don't have a table of contents in the book. I translate some terms, and I translate exactly one poem in Ilocano towards the end. And so I was really thinking through some of these questions and really inspired by a lot of the work of my fellow panelists here today. I want to think about the book that I just came out with and think and really sort of advance that, even though it, I've conceptualized it as a sort of global history of Filipino racialization through plantation capitalism and its racial archives, what the underlying political unconscious of its archipelagic critique is. And what I tried to do in this book was attune myself to the ways that these disparate languages that constitute this loose association called the Filipino, how that transforms in diaspora, particularly in the earliest waves of trans-Pacific migration from the early 20th century through the end of World War II. The vast majority of migrant workers in the US, remember, we're not from the Tagalog-speaking regions of the Philippines. And so why do our approaches, both in American studies and generally in area studies, right? Why do we carve out the Philippines as a Tagalog and English and Spanish majority language when there are all these vernaculars, right? Not just in a way to point to the pluralism and the sort of like DEI diversity sort of logic around polylingualism of the Philippines, but really to point to, I think, the tenuousness and the contingency and indeed the fragility of the project that is the Philippine nation state that becomes undermined by its very vernacular reality of a multilingual people, right? And so part of really most spoke any of in the early 1920s, 10s, 30s, any of the several Visayan languages, as well as Ilocano, the lingua franca of Northern Luzon. And I want to take that up, and I've been taking that up in my most recent book that I've been working on called Balikbayan, The Invention of the Filipino Homeland. And thinking about the way that the Tagalogization of the Philippines also enclosed a multi-ethnic diaspora into the linguistic registers of the nation, right? So there's this assumption in the historiography that, Tagalogization is something that happens at home, and then Tagalog-speaking diasporas often proliferate, in the post-war, post-independence, post-1965 Hart-Celler Act sort of period, right? But I wanted to think about, in the current project I'm working on, that one did not follow the other. That is, it is not quite precise to say that Tagalog-speaking Filipinos came to dominate the diaspora after formal independence, but rather they happened simultaneously. That is, the Tagalogization nationalist linguistic project of trying to, create what Deleuze and Guattari might call the romance of coherent nationhood through its linguistic registers happened both at home and the diaspora, and it often incorporated the two to prepare diaspora subjects to become subjects of a nation yet to come, right? So these efforts at synchronizing the non-Tagalog diasporas towards a nationalistic fealty to a Manila-based polity also involved training overseas migrants in Tagalog. And some of the work I've been doing looks at the ways that this pedagogical sort of nationalization, counterinsurgent nationalism is what I call in the book, kind of happened. And it's often through performance. So the teaching of songs, the teaching of rituals, the teaching of, using fraternal organizations and mutual aid societies as a venue to teach non-Tagalog peoples the future national language of what is ostensibly a bourgeois, cacique, elite, dynastic project under American imperialism, right? Because the U.S. empire empowers native elites to become the sort of synecdoches of this what Alfred McCoy might call like the independent nation without decolonization, right? And so I want to end by reading a section from my recent book, Bundok, on page 91, from chapter 6, Manong's on the Move, which is my reinterpretation of the history of Filipino migrants between the two world wars, and thinking about, what does it mean to center the history of that migration and their transits from a place that recognizes their non-Tagalogness and from their place that recognizes how they had to navigate the different linguistic registers of the settler colony known as the United States, and the ways that also they were even compelled to learn Tagalog as they were in transit by virtue of many things. Number one, their displacement and their loneliness, but number two, through these mutual aid societies that I've been studying. So the section, and it's really fun. It's been really fun to perform live too, because sometimes you could perform it with 3 people. It's best read in a group. It's called From Nakem to Kamalayan. Nakem is the Ilocano word for it's like the innards, right? The inner soul consciousness, right? And then Kamalayan is the same thing in Tagalog. So life for the Manos was not all fun and games. In order to get to the point of recreation, Ilocano migrant men needed to quickly find a way to establish themselves in a land not their own, often at a port of their own choosing. Before I move on, this section of the chapter is written in 3 languages, and I'm not going to translate. And in fact, I do that with a reader a lot, where they have to flip to the end notes in order to like try to sit with the discomfort of linguistic alienation. So Ilocanos first searched para dagiti kailianda kin kailukuanda when they arrived on the continent. Some, such as the lumber workers Sinforoso Ordonia, found it in Valerlago, Tikasinsin na Tagabawang Ijela Union, who found him work in Alaska. Barangay transnational kinship structures were indeed important for establishing labor migrations in the West. Tagnawa, or the Ilocano ethic of mutual aid and social support for less fortunate kin, perpetuated also in a trans-Pacific context, but these affective kinships were not afforded to everyone, nor were they always sustained, no matter where Ilocano young men went to work. It is important to note that the experience of alienation and loneliness that Ilocanos faced occurred in a multilingual context. Tagalog had not yet been implemented as a national language, so migrants from Northern Luzon use some English, the occasional Spanish, and of course, Ilocano. To conclude, I chart out in 3 languages the feelings of homesickness expressed by one migrant worker and how he made do with becoming Filipino in tongues not his own. As you read the passage below, you may need to flip between the words on the page and the endnotes, or otherwise between different modes of linguistic consciousness, if you understand some of the text. Tagapasuki ni Jay Ilocos Norte ni Manang Teodolo Ranho, awan naganak na nagnaad ni Manang Teodolo kinikit na nagigiyan ni Manang Teodolo ijay siyata ka barangay, ijay cosmopolis to yung muna trabaho na ijay factory at ikahonta na bago ni gayam na may papani ti trabaho ijay lauda Washington. Sumabat ti dua gayam ijay batak ijay Ilocos Norte met. Namnito na non nagawat na ti surat ni kasinsin na kunan na ti narigat kan malidliday nga biyaga trabaho ijay Amerika. The first time, and this is a quote from the oral histories done in the 1970s at the Filipino American National Historical Society. The first time I received a letter from home, Unanak and Cynthia Mejia, it happened. It happened from my first cousin. That letter hit me. I must have been homesick, lonesome, homesick. I don't know what happened. I went right between these piles of lumber. I read that letter and I cried in there. The first day I worked over there, boy, I thought that was some needles around here. Nasangit naman ng Teodolo iti baro lalaki awan pamilya wala kay lupon kay nana. Nakasalita ni Manang Teodolo ti English kanilokano ito na nurabasu ijay United States ngam saan na nakasalita na ti Tagalog nakadal na ti Tagalog ken dagiti grupo sa Balia Pilipino natasaan ang kailukuan da. That's all in Ilocano. It's only here when I learned Tagalog, here in the United States. So you don't get out of place if somebody talks in Tagalog. I switched to Tagalog. Kailang nag-aral na si Manang Teodolo ang Tagalog, nakapagsalita siya sa kanyang mga kababayan at saka nakapagkilala siya ang bagong uri ng pagkakamag-anak sa labas ng mga bayan nila, Pilipino o siguro Pinoy. Sa di mas alang yung isang na mga grupo ng kapisanan sa komunidad ng mga Pilipino sa mga lungsod ay naging Pilipino siya. Yung nakam niya, nagbago yun sa kamalayan. We dream about the Philippines, he says. These are the closest, especially Dimas Alam. They preach about serving the Philippines and all that. We tried to help gain independence, That's why we were really lonesome, homesick for the Philippines, to see the Philippines again. But it was impossible for us to go because we couldn't earn enough money for our passage at that time, end quote. Manong Teodolo, like many diasporic migrants, became Filipino away from the Philippines. It was an uneven, messy, and incomplete process of flitting between different tongues and registers, or what language historian Vicente Rafael might call a war on translation. However, the national language was not only enforced in the homeland, but was also a necessary tactic of ethnic survival in the diaspora. Just like how Ilocanos learned of an America through an imagined geography, they learned about the Philippines and became Filipino by imagining the archipelago in a language and a history that was not theirs. The everyday experience of language alienation and diasporic code switching of folks such as Teodolo attest to a multilingual linguistic landscape experienced by Ilocano, Bisaya, and other Philippine migrant workers. Without a shared vocabulary, they instead shared experience of the ways they saw the land, wished themselves to be seen, danced and rolled dice on their own time, felt thrilled by the pace of travel, and undertook the burden of the rhythm of labor discipline. Eventually, some common grammar of Filipino diasporic life would arise, but through an enforced language of Tagalog and a Manila-centric nationalist historiography. In the process, Ilocanos translated their nakam into Kamalayan, and their native utang na imbaga nakam, which means in Ilocano, debt from a good conscience, to their hometown family, into a nationalist utang na loob, Tagalog from debt from within, to a newly imagined bayan, homeland. Perhaps it was a good alternative to the feeling of alienation as migrant workers, which, while thrilling, was certainly exhausting and unbearably lonely. Nevertheless, an underlying ambivalence about Tagalog in Manong Teodolo's story suggests that another process of alienation, one of diasporic nationalism, tugged at the affective landscape of Ilocano men circulating around the United States. Without a place to call home and without a means to buy a house to call home, a homeland would have to be imagined, even if that homeland was not theirs. Thank you.
I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Those were Evan, our last speaker, and Gateway.
All right. Thank you so much, Susan. And thank you, Brian and Adrian, for the wonderful presentations. Yes, I think there's so many points of resonance. And I also just want to thank as well, Chris and Erwin, for putting this virtual panel together and all the logistics that went into that. And thank you, everyone who's joining us on YouTube as well. So I have a couple slides. I'm going to go ahead and share screen, and then we will jump right into it. Okay, so let me see. Okay, awesome. So the title that I'm working with today is Archipelagic Translations Across Language and Space, Connecting Vietnam, Israel-Palestine, and Korea in the US Imperial Frame. So this presentation explores what the conjunction of translation and archipelagic thought can elucidate about the resonances of US military empire across multiple sites. So as Brian kind of reiterated and laid out for us, right, the archipelago suggests repetition with a difference, the clustering together of multiple islands of US imperial formation, whose connections to one another may at first seem submerged below the surface. And this is where the archipelago as a structuring metaphor is really helpful here. So to think the archipelago and translation in relation is to analyze how concepts are unevenly translated. And I'm going to think about translation linguistically, but also translation as this mobility, right, that Brian pointed out for us, across distinct islands of US war making that together make up a larger archipelago of US empire. So this presentation is going to proceed also in two parts. I'm going to take the part structure from Brian's presentation to draw conceptual linkages between my first book project, which Susan introduced, Archipelago of Resettlement. And then towards the end, I'll talk a little bit about some preliminary thoughts for the second project. So I'm going to talk about linguistics translation, mostly in part one, and then think about spatial translation in part two. But again, as kind of Brian mentioned with this Oxford, definition of translation, the two, of course, are always intertwined with one another. Okay, so to discuss linguistic translation, I'm going to draw from an example from my first book, Archipelago of Resettlement, Vietnamese Refugee Settlers and Decolonization Across Guam and Israel-Palestine. And in the book, I tried to explicitly theorize the archipelago as a spatial analytic for examining multiple spaces of Vietnamese refugee resettlement. So thinking about Vietnamese refugees who passed through and also resettled in the US territory of Guam or Guam, as well as in Palestine or the state of Israel. But also thinking about how these archipelago where Vietnamese refugees ended up also helps elucidate what I call an archipelago of US empire, but also different resonances across different indigenous movements for decolonization. I also just want to kind of acknowledge the timeliness, right, of this presentation, and just a nod towards the ongoing genocide in Gaza. And so just trying to kind of emphasize, the stakes of a lot of the conversations that we are trying to have here. Okay. So thanks for the shout out, Brian. But as he mentioned, chapter 6 of the book is called The Politics of Translation. So I'm going to talk a little bit more from that part of the book, in which I examine the imperfect translation of key terms, such as return or new immigrants, from Hebrew to Vietnamese. And we can think about the heteroglossia, right, that Adrian kind of brought up for us. So thinking about translation from Hebrew to Vietnamese, but also that spatial translation, right, from Israel-Palestine to Vietnam and back again. And to think about these resonant politics of land contestation at different sites of colonial wake. So first, I'm just going to start with some historical context for those who are less familiar. So from 1977 to 79, the state of Israel resettled 3 waves of 366 total Vietnam War refugees. So although this seems like a demographically pretty small number, right, less than 400, this group of Vietnamese Israelis is very politically significant, particularly within the domestic politics, since it marks the first time that Israel offered asylum, let alone citizenship, to non-Jewish subjects. And furthermore, since then, since the 1970s, the case has remained quite a political exception within Israel's very strict asylum policy, which, despite European Jews' own history of refugeehood with the Holocaust, the Israeli state continues to displace, dispossess, and kill Palestinian refugees and exiles, as well as turn away asylum seekers from Eritrea, Sudan, and Syria. So we can think about this projection, right, of a homogenous national project that I think Adrian's analysis of the Philippines is really resonant here as well. I also just want to note here that Vietnamese Israelis were resettled on contested land, and Palestinians had no say in the question of their resettlement. So in order to unpack the politics of translation within this vexed historical and contemporary context, so where do Vietnamese refugees and migrants kind of fit in? I'd like to share with you a scene from a 2005 documentary film, The Journey of Van Nguyen. So the film follows 2 characters who you can see here. So the first one is Van Nguyen, who is a Vietnamese Israeli poet. She was born in Ashkelon in 1982. And the other main character, nonfiction character, is her father, Hoi Mai Nguyen. So he came to Israel with the 3rd wave of Vietnam War refugees in 1979. Kind of another connection with Adrian. They were actually waited for a long time in a refugee camp in the Philippines, almost for a year, before gaining acceptance and offer of resettlement in the state of Israel. So when reading their respective poetry, they're both poets, the 2 main characters of the film, Vung and Hoai Mi, speak in their respective native languages, so Hebrew and Vietnamese, respectively. But when they speak to each other, they switch or they translate constantly between native Hebrew, between Vietnamese accented Hebrew, between native Vietnamese, and then also Hebrew accented Vietnamese, sometimes changing mid-sentence, cobbling together a shared language across the potential impasses or walls of translation. So here we can really think about those pathways of translation, right, that Brian was mentioning for us, as well as this kind of idea of cacophony that Adrian brought up. So because very few people are fluent in both languages, right, Hebrew and Vietnamese, the film relies on translation to prefer meaning, right? So then there's also the kind of linguistic situatedness of the viewer. So the main subtitles, there's a Hebrew version or an English version. And for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to focus on the English subtitle version. So this everyday linguistic translation opens up a space for a translation I want to mention or kind of convey to us of land politics from Vietnam to Palestine. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this land politics and what it might mean for decolonization. Okay, so I'm going to share with you a scene from the end of the film. So I'm going to go ahead and play the clip, and then I will talk about it. So hopefully this will still, you'll still hear the sound, but someone kind of wave at me if you don't hear it.
Ồ, bà ơi, con về đây.
Aber bên đấy tam gia bay sẽ không sẽ phá bay.
Vô nhà tay ngồi đi đâu ngoài đất ha.
Nhà nó phá nhà hết hả?
Phá độ mấy chục năm rồi.
Để ba sẽ thử xăm cái nào gì là sự mới chung.
Một sáng xin mấy chục. Rồi biết đi xuân.
Và khi sửa xuân bay, mình sẽ
Xuân. Nhà ram em đưa gì mà đi vào đây xin.
em muốn lên cái gì? Mexico. Mexico.
Con sẽ ta cái gì sắp ta xin học.
Okay, so as you can see here, the English subtitles don't distinguish, right, between when one of the characters is speaking Hebrew or Vietnamese. So unless you are familiar with either of these languages or can hear the kind of differences, linguistic differences, it kind of conveys a sort of homogenization of the linguistic translations that are happening here, right? So I'm just going to kind of unpack what happened in this scene and then share how it talks a little bit about land politics. So in the scene, Hoài My, who we see here, guides Van and the documentary film crew through tropical trees and rice fields in Vietnam in search of his father's plot of land that he had to give up when he fled Vietnam as an anti-communist refugee, and that was then taken over by the communist government and redistributed. So as they walk, Hoài My asks onlooking villagers for directions, invoking the name of his father, Kak Minh, and they wave him forward down the road. So after orienting himself, Hoài My raises his arms and calls out excitedly to the surrounding trees, "Oh, ba ma ang day," or "Oh, father, mother, I'm here." So Van follows, asking her father in Hebrew, her native language, where his house would be. And he responds, again in Vietnamese, that the house is most likely gone by now. Van spots another house nearby and suggests, again in Hebrew, that they approach and inquire about Hoài My's familial home. And then here, Hoài My is going to switch to Hebrew, and he replies that the neighbors probably wouldn't know since they are Olim Kadashim, which is a Hebrew term for new immigrants. So surprised by the use of this term, which in the Israeli context refers specifically to Jewish immigrants, right, who immigrant or quote unquote return to Israel-Palestine under the law of return, Van parrots incredulously, Olim Kadashim me efo, so new immigrants from where? But before the viewer gets a response, the scene cuts to a different shot of Hoài My pointing out the vast reach of his ancestral lands, while his daughter Van looks on admiringly. And this is the screenshot that you see here. So I want to talk a little bit more about this term, right, Olim Kadashim. So Hoài My's usage of the term Olim Kadashim translates the scene of Vietnamese refugee land reclamation from Vietnam into the vexed vocabulary of Israel-Palestine's own land contestations. So Olim Kadashim, derived from the word aliyah, refers specifically, as I mentioned, to Jewish immigrants who return to Israel-Palestine under the so-called law of return. And in identifying the post-war communist sympathetic Vietnamese newcomers who are now living on his land as Olim Kadashim, or new immigrants who have the backing, right, of state authority, Hoài My implicitly positions himself as a dispossessed native Palestinian, and this metaphor is binary. So I just want to mention here, to be clear, such a metaphor does risk a historical erasure of the particular settler colonial dynamics structuring Israel-Palestine. However, I want us to kind of sit with the imperfections, right? Or the kind of, I think Brian put it, the sort of ad hoc or rough translations that we see here, right? So by translating the vocabulary of land rights, so charged in the Israel-Palestine context, into the post-war Vietnamese context, Hoài My also introduces a possible vector of distinct yet parallel experiences of land dispossession, right, felt by these Vietnamese refugees who had to give up their ancestral lands, and then also Palestinians, right, who are forced from their ancestral lands as well. So if we think about this question of solidarity, right, to think about the ASA call, what potentials for solidarity between Vietnamese Israelis and Palestinians in Israel-Palestine could be further developed from this kind of linguistic nexus. So a turn to the English subtitles for this scene, I think, further facilitates this possibility. So although the term Olim Kadashim is politically neutral, perhaps even celebratory of this kind of idea of Jewish return to the homeland, right, of Israel, the film's English subtitles translate Olim Kadashim not as new immigrants, but as you can see here, as settlers. And this adds another complex layer of politicized rhetoric. So the word settlers flashes across the screen twice in white text, one for Huaymi's assertion and then for Bung's surprised follow-up question. And this more explicitly frames Jewish immigration to Israel-Palestine as part of this Zionist state structure of settler colonialism, right? So thinking about the connection between settler and settler colonialism and what critiques that opens up for us. So according to my colleague at UCLA, Lubna Kutomi, the quote, Palestine analytic moves beyond thinking of Palestine as an isolated issue or an ethnic or geographic-based cause, and instead allows for thinking through the particularities of Zionist settler colonialism as informed by and informing structures of oppression globally. So it's this kind of movement, right, between the particular and the global that I think the archipelagic thought opens up for us. But it's also a critique, right, of kind of nationalist and nation state formations, as Adrian's presentation is pointing out for us as well. So Huaymi's usage of the term Olim Kadashim invites archipelagic translations between land dispossession in the settler colonial state of Israel and the post-war communist state of Vietnam, between Palestinians' indigenous politics of return and Vietnamese Israelis' refugee politics of return. So this documentary film, The Journey of Van Wing, reminds viewers of the importance of land politics for both displaced refugees and indigenous subjects. That is, the politics of return to the very soil, plants, and waters that sustained one's family for generations. So, of course, it's important to remember that these structural antagonisms, right, that divide Vietnamese Israelis and Palestinians remain very material. Just as an anecdote, I've been following some of these Vietnamese Israelis, right, on Facebook. We keep in touch. And of course, for many of them, there's a strong identification with the Israeli state and the kind of sense of victimhood, right, kind of post October 7th. So we can kind of think about the ways that they are interpolated into the nationalism. So these translations are very catacratic to think through Gertrude Spivak's term. However, the film proposes potential grounds for solidarity between Vietnamese Israelis and displaced Palestinians around distinct yet parallel experiences of land dispossession and subsequent struggles for land reclamation in Israel-Palestine as well as in Vietnam. So recognizing their own attachments to their ancestral lands, Nước Nam, Vietnamese Israelis can perhaps come to empathize with Palestinian refugees and exiles' own desires for the right of return to their ancestral villages in historic Palestine and work to make those aspirations a reality. So now I'm going to turn to part 2 of my presentation, which further thinks about how this idea of linguistic translation also can inform this idea of mobility or spatial translation. And I'm going to share with you some preliminary thoughts from my second book project, Revisiting the Southern Question, South Korea, South Vietnam, and the US South. Okay. So taking Antonio Gramsci's 1926 essay, Some Aspects of the Southern Question, as a point of departure, this project examines how different concepts, connotations, and ideas that cohere around understandings of the South, right, as this kind of potent signifier, change as they are translated from one Southern locale to another. I'm not going to talk about Gramsci too much here, but I'm happy to answer it in the Q&A if folks want to learn more. So focusing on South Vietnam, South Korea, and the US South, right, so very kind of a Cold War context, invites us to consider articulations and invocations of the South that do not easily conform to the presumed political homogeneity that's sometimes implied with the invocation of the global South, right? So typically when we hear the term global South, we might think anti-colonial, revolutionary, or socialist projects and politics, particularly during the kind of Third World Liberation movement. However, during this period, South Vietnam and South Korea were spaces of US intervention. They aligned with the United States and Empire and the Cold War order, and they therefore seemingly to be on the other side, right, of the kind of Third World Liberation movement or this kind of Cold War binaries. So how do we kind of understand and interrogate their Southern politics then, right? The kind of South of South Vietnam or the South of South Korea, and what is putting the US South into juxtaposition kind of open up. So in other words, what does the South mean in the wake of US empire as it translates across a global Asia's Cold War context? So these are some of the questions that I'm thinking through. So I want to share just two quick examples of how I'm trying to think through these questions in conversation with cultural production from Korean, Vietnamese, as well as Korean diasporic, Vietnamese diasporic, and Black or African American literature and film and art. So Susan Choi's novel, The Foreign Student from 2004, offers a literary example of these vexed Southern spatial translations. So when the protagonist, Chang-un, Korean War refugee and recent foreign exchange student, finds himself faced with the challenge of explaining the Korean War to a congregation of white Southern Americans at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in 1955 in Jackson, Tennessee, he translates the seeming inscrutability of the Korean War into the terminology of the US Civil War. So translates the foreignness of South Korea into the intimate geography of the US South, right, given his audience. So this is a quote from the book. Korea is shaped just like Florida, yes? The top half is a communist state and the bottom half are fighting for democracy. He would groundlessly compare the Mason-Dixon line, would see every head nod excitedly. In June 1950, the Communist Army comes over the parallel and invades the South. They come by surprise and get almost all of the sea. The communists go fast until the UN forces crowded into a very little space at the bottom of Korea around the city of Busan. He pronounced it for them loudly, Busan. This is like if the war is all over Florida and our side are trapped in Miami, end quote. So here I kind of just want to point out this groundlessly, right? So there's, again, this kind of recognition of the catacratic nature of translation. So via Chang's translation here, Korea becomes Florida, the 38th parallel becomes the Mason-Dixon line, Busan becomes Miami. In this passage, the referent for the South remains actually quite slippery, right? So the South means a political entity fighting for democratic sovereignty against the kind of supposed or projected invasion of the North. So this could refer to South Korea in June 1950, but also the Southern Confederacy almost a century earlier, given the prior sentences of the Mason-Dixon line. So in this translation between these two civil wars, two Southern geographies, Chang also translates his foreign body into the sociality of the US South. So he says, this is like if the war is all over Florida and our side are trapped in Miami. So think about that our, right? The use of the first person plural. Chang performs a kind of two-way translation. So he asserts a shared camaraderie with his Southern American audience, shaped by the legacy of the US Civil War. But he also invites them to identify, right, with the Civil War in his own homeland, the decolonizing nation of Korea. So, of course, this kind of translation is very Beck's, right? And we think about this question of solidarities, what does it mean to kind of express solidarity with kind of Southern Confederate politics? So another kind of question I have is, right, how can we think about alternative Southern legacies, right? What if South Korean and South Vietnamese subjects rejected the Southern politics of the Confederacy and lost cause rhetoric, and instead embraced an alternative Southern legacy routed through Black survival and resistance to the afterlives of slavery? So We can find a glimpse, I think, of such alternative Southern translations, both spatial and linguistic, in Hunyo's installation, "And We Are Still Here, But We Are Still Here." And this is from 2021, so you can see an excerpt here. So a little bit more about the artist. So born in a Vietnamese refugee camp in Hong Kong and having grown up in the US South, so North Carolina, Newell created this installation for the Contemporary Art Center, New Orleans, as part of Prospect 5, the city's triennial art event. Consisting of hectograph print as well as block letter cut posters hanging from the ceiling, the installation features the English phases, "We are still here, but we are still here." But they're also, as you can see here, translated into Vietnamese, Louisiana Creole, Khoi Bini, making the ongoing presence of Black, Native, Creole, and diasporic Vietnamese communities on the lands and waters of Bulbancha, the Choctaw name for New Orleans. So as the project description reveals, these, quote, "low-tech, highly accessible prints created using a water solution reference a communist anti-colonial movement that employed this medium to swiftly disseminate sensitive information," end quote. But they also, in the New Orleans context, allude to the history of the transatlantic slave trade. So this is another quote. "Water is a force that has brought commerce and life to the port city while harboring potential violence," end quote. So thinking about water and kind of Brian's term of border waters here, it's this kind of pathway that facilitates some of these interconnections within the situated space of Bulbancha. So overall, the installation bears witness to multiple forms of Southern translations, tracing how forcibly displaced African, Vietnamese, and Indigenous communities and the intersections between them come to coexist in the space of New Orleans necessitates, I think, an archipelagic form of thought, a mapping of archipelagoes of translation. So I'm just going to conclude and wrap up here and share Lanny Thompson's concept of archipelagics, which has been really helpful for my thinking, which he defines or emphasizes as, quote, "discontinuous connections rather than physical proximity, fluid movements across porous margins rather than delimited borders, and complex spatial networks rather than oblique horizons or landscapes. In some, moving islands rather than fixed geographic formations," end quote. So I think this idea of archipelagics attend to how war, empire, racial capitalism, and settler colonialism shape linguistic and spatial translations and the intersections between the two. But they can also decenter hegemonic power, instead focusing on how Southern actors, refugees, migrants, and Indigenous subjects make sense of their lived experiences of translation via storytelling, writing, art making, and world building. So thank you so much.
That was really incredible. The number of both implicit and explicit links, each of you called out the other at a certain point, but there were many other places where we could have done more. There are no comments. We're getting our heads up. There are no comments in the YouTube chat, but there are 12 people watching. So my suggestion is each of you ask the other, ask all three, including yourself, a central question. Do you want to try that? In other words, let's start the conversation. I can do it too, if you'd prefer to have me start. And then each of you jump in. Brian, yes? Okay, good.
I'd love to ask a question. Evan was concluding her presentation talking about Lanny Thompson's outline of archipelagics, a spatiality without contiguity, and notions that destabilize fixed perceptions of space, including moving islands. One of the thematics that I saw as I listened to and participated in the three of our presentations, had to do with the unfixing of a certain notion of translation, which is the notion of translation as transpiring between two languages, and the conventional journey upon which the classic trope of translation depends is journey from source text to target language, which involves a lot of fixity. The archipelago offers something beyond fixity, and it offers certainly something beyond two.
I think that unfixing might be a really interesting verb for us. Just the three things that I really noticed in all of your talks was the focus on the refusal to translate. Adrian did it by reading so much without any kind of translation. You get to hear the language. Brian talked about it just in open terms of refusal to translate. And I think Evan discussed it in the way the subtitles. It's not mistranslation. You never called it that. See, that it's something about the importance of not translating. So that was one thing. Another is the way time would be part of the unfixing. Evan kept stressing the Civil War analogy in your part 2 on the Global South as one that takes place across space, but across time as well. You all three did that. I think only we focused less on how time works. And I do think the idea of, as in so many geographers writing about their regions, their space-time, they usually use space-time. And I thought I used that a lot in my American Mediterranean book. And language, what you can do is say there's space-time dash language dimensionality, 3-dimensionality to our project of unfinishing. So that's the second one, just time. How do you think about time in each of your projects? And the third one, this goes back to Brian, such a focus on the metaphors of translation. I kept thinking, well, archipelagic thought adds materiality. And you, at one point, you basically say that. So I think we could again do something with metaphor and materiality. Because we are definitely you're all doing deeply materialist histories, Marxist oriented, and that's important to all of us. And I think that would be one way to get, in a way, beyond our standing as literary people to something that, Adrian has better under control or under his something, which is the historian sensibility, which we all have. And it's the idea, how does translation as archipelagic thought or archipelagic translation help to bring together history and literature, which are the ones that we're constantly bridging.
Can I take a stab at that?
God, yes. I mean, yes.
Yeah, there are a couple of things that come to mind. So I'm going to stage this as a conversation between Lisan, who we talk about a lot, right? And really rooting Lisantian thought to the Caribbean, not just as a spatial archipelago, but as a linguistic one, right? Number one. Number two, I'm thinking about Naoki Sakai as well, the Japan historian and translation theorist who worked at Cornell for a long time. He had this book called Translation and Subjectivity, right, in 1997, right? And I keep coming back to that a lot in a lot of ways because, it's both are arguing that translation, like language itself, like interlocution, is something that supersedes just the speech act. Like we often place so much primacy onto the voice, right? The voice of the author, the new diverse voices, whatever the literary establishment like decides to call like its new commodities, right? But in placing so much primacy on the voice, we often forget the fact that interlocution also involves listening, thus relation, thus comprehension or miscomprehension. And so, I think both Sakai and Glisson are sort of pushing us to think about translation specifically as relation, whether the violent imposition thereof in the case of Sakai and like, thinking about like Japanese imperialism, US imperialism, and how, US and Japanese imperialism in the Pacific actually brokers the sort of power relations that facilitate both language empires like desire to be as transparent or at least as homeomorphic, right, to each other as possible. And as we know, if two languages have no relation to each other, right, what that not necessarily in the sort of like etymological, right, if that lived relation is not established, then translation is not yet established, right? Insofar as, maybe there are a few like, scholars who study like different translations between different languages. But why I mention this is that the way I interpret an archipelagic thinking, again, like I beyond the sort of socio-spatial, is that if we were to think about it as a different form of articulating a relation, one that is rooted, in Glissantian theory, what I wanted to do in Barangay also is to take that to its fullest conclusion, which is, I have this one poem in the translation/tributary section called On Denial. And it's the denial of it's about the denial of translation throughout the entire book. And it's an erotic poem. And it's about the politics, the sort of Freud meets Derrida, the sort of politics of edging, right? And thinking about what is it, the perfect translation is an asymptote. It can never be met. Right. And thus, nonetheless, if you have a relation, you should still try. And you should also think about the way where denial takes place, where the untranslatable both exists within the target or source language, but also where the untranslatable is just a matter of setting boundaries, right? Political boundaries, right? Against the colonizer, for example. Like there's one of the powerful things I think about doing Philippine studies is not just the heterogeneity of languages, but in order to understand why there are so many languages that still persist today, and that Spanish did not become the hegemon, was really to understand, the historical place of the Catholic Church, right? And trying to make sure natives don't speak Spanish, so they don't have access to the king and the sovereign, right? And so what changes with the United States when the sovereign is capital itself in an imperial liberal democracy? Everybody speaks English, right? Because that, for me, the way I interpret that is like everybody was taught English because it's cheap human resource training, right? Like you want people to do migrant labor abroad, right? You need them to know the target language. And so what do you do? You start with the educational system back home. And so that's sort of the way that I approach sort of an archipelagic attunement to the archives, less about spatial and more about being comfortable with being able to draw out exactly and precisely and rigorously what relations exist between people, dialects, cultures, languages, empires, nation states, etc.
You guys want to say, yeah, Evan, go.
I can jump in, but Brian, do you want to go ahead first?
Either one.
Oh, no, you go first and then
We
I'll
should
talk.
unmute ourselves, just
Okay.
period, and not to give primacy to the voice, but just something about unmute yourselves. Go ahead.
Yeah. I'm at my family's house. I have family in the background, so I might be muting myself periodically. But yeah, I mean, thank you so much for all these comments and provocations. Susan, I just want to say a little bit about this question of time and space time. I really appreciated that you brought that up for us. And it just makes me think too about how for refugees and migrants, right, the space that they leave is also frozen in a particular kind of time, right? So if we think about the film, the space of Vietnam that Van Nguyen's father, Hoài My, leaves, right, it's kind of a post-war of moment of, still kind of a contingency of what was going to happen to his land before the kind of communist redistribution. of his ancestral homelands, right? And so what he's returning to is not just the space of Vietnam, but kind of like a pre-war, pre-kind of communist unification of Vietnam, and sort of thinking about how that is inflecting, right, these mobilities and translations as well. Also the kind of Vietnamese, right, that he learns and that is like inflects his poetry, and that he can teach to his children is also kind of in a kind of this pre-1970s understanding of Vietnamese as well. I mean, one of the things that I think this kind of conversation is bringing up for me is what is productive about moving from a kind of an understanding of transnational American studies to archipelagic American studies. And Brian, I know you and Michelle kind of take up this question, and so I'm just going to pose it again, I guess, in your book, your edited volume. But one of the things, Adrian, that really stuck out to me that you said in your presentation is that one of the things that you find helpful about American studies is not just this kind of like transnational, like one nation state relating to another nation state, but the critique of the colonial importation, right, of the nation state as the kind of spatial logic that organizes subjectivities, right? So that is kind of like what is being taken from American studies. And I think that is very kind of like an archipelagic critique in and of itself. And Brian, I think the kind of project that you are doing too, right, and really taking us to these Java and Indonesian terms, right, is not to say, oh, I'm looking at where Indonesian migrants went, or Indonesian Americans per se, but there's something actually about sitting with this language within the kind of archipelago, and how is that actually still an American studies kind of project. So those are just kind of some thoughts that I had that I think we're rethinking, what kind of these other kind of spatial geographies might mean for the field.
Thanks, Evan, and thanks, Adrian and Susan. As I think about this session, I get stuck in a good way on a poem that Adrian read, that I only heard fleetingly, obviously, and I haven't had the benefit of rereading it. But at one point, Adrian, you offered us a really compelling image, which, as I'm recalling it after briefly hearing it, was take these sands from this beach and then run them through an hourglass.
Yeah.
And the image is so rich in terms of thinking about the question of.
Can I share the poem on screen while we do it?
Do.
Yeah.
Yes.
Here we go. That's what it looks like too. So it's both tree, like cedar tree, but also the wake of a boat. So sorry, continue.
Okay, so I see until the shoal. I see that hourglass phrase. Would you mind just reading that quotation where the hourglass shows up?
Let me start with the rhetorical questions, because it's a sequence of three. Can we burn the water's waxy leaves into necessary medicine? Will we breathe its smoke until our memory scars over? Or will our time be denied from us until the shoal beds the dead into the grains of an hourglass?
The shoal beds the dead into the grains of an hourglass. That image is so much more complex than I remembered it. And so there's no way I'll do justice to it. It's something that I'll have to sit with, but I'll take a small portion of the image. The shoal composed of sand, each grain of sand seeming like might be from the same time, but it is not from the same time. Each grain of sand winds up being, taken from a different temporality, a different generation of coral or rock or erosion. And one grain of sand may have been created either by the digestive processes of a fish or by a hurricane during the year of 1999. One might have been created during the year of 1648, and yet they're all piled up on the beach together. And so we have this symbol of the beach, or this the spatiality of the beach that has been so important to Glissant and the beach walker and thinking about the opacity of the world. And it really does wind up being opaque, the origin of each grain of sand. And Adrian takes each grain of sand and lets them fall through the hourglass as if to emphasize the different temporalities encoded in each grain of sand, even as they each wind up being analogous in some way, something that can fit through a narrow space. And by this pouring of the sand, they keep track of they keep track of an archipelagic time that is different from the times that they all came from. And I see this image of the almost stringing together of the grains of sand in analogy to Derek Walcott as he talks about the string of islands. And yet what you did in your presentation, as you read to us from your book, you strung together what might be taken as metaphorically grains of sand, passages in different languages, each of which contain different temporalities, but they're brought into like an hourglass pouring. And so we get contiguity and disparity at the same time in a way that I think provocatively asks us to reconceive what Edwin Gensler has called post-translation. He's allied the notion of post-translation with rewriting, but if I could say, post-translational stance in the book winds up being something more akin to refusal to rewrite. And I wonder, actually, Adrian, if you could talk a little bit about the refusal.
Yeah, first of all, the live close reading that I just tweeted about that you just did of my poem, thank you. There's as you were sort of talking, I think, if we were to take let's take the conceit of the archipelago to its fullest conclusion, right? And sort of scale it to other sort of like ecological critical contexts. Number one, like the shoreline, and I'm thinking both here in terms of like a lot of the material realities of the Salish Sea, which is where I was writing this book a lot. And this was so the specific context is I wrote this poem on Bainbridge Island, which is a ferry across Seattle. And I have family and relations out there as well. So, but second, what does it mean to what Tiffany Thabo called shoaling? What does it mean to do that kind of work with respect to the specific materialities of like these kinds of places? So like I'll be specific, which is like the Salish Sea, but also in like where I grew up. So I grew up in like the northern shores of Lake Ontario in a suburb called Scarborough, which is just to the east of Toronto. One provocation that myself and other local artists have been thinking about is, the Seneca villages, the Anishinaabe sort of history and geohistory of that place is in itself like brackish and tributary and riverine and maritime and archipelagic. And thus the land acknowledgement just like simply does not work, right? Because it sort of recapitulates that sort of partitioning of like the land property logics of the settler state onto a place that really is organized in the indigenous sense, is organized spatially along the portage, right? Along the canoes going upriver to Lake Simcoe, along the different fishing villages that may appear in and may appear out along the shores. And it's also and the way that the city of Toronto superimposed itself onto what is ostensibly a river delta by burying rivers. And there's all these like haunted stories of like haunted rivers, and you can hear these like these rivers long gone up in Toronto as well, right? And I'm thinking about the fact that, what does it mean for, I think, speaking of the enmeshment, the shoring up of different temporalities, right? That so many of the diasporas who have settled in Scarborough settlers of color are from these like dispossessed spaces, but also these archipelagic maritime spaces. So the Guyanese, the Trinidadians, right, the big Jamaican community, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, the Philippines, West Africa, like we're thinking East Africa as well, the Indian Ocean, right, the big Tamil diaspora, right, the Rohingya diaspora, and just thinking about the ways that really like shores, right, like sands itself. I really appreciate the way that you sort of ground what Jean-Luc Nancy was talking about, which is like the community is the touch but not meld, right?
Mhm.
That the relation is not one of becoming this sort of coherent nation or coherent singular subject, but one that reckons with the fact that one grain might be, from the Paleolithic era or whatever, or another grain might be coral, or another grain might just be literally a glass shard, right? And so what does it mean to hold those increments? And so I like the post-translation because I think the way I've been thinking about it is like as parallax, as aporia, as incommensurability, as asymptote. And being on, I think this critique that we're all sort of advancing is really a provocation to be uncomfortable with incoherence, or to be comfortable with incoherence, right? And therefore to be comfortable, or like to push ourselves into relation rather than take the coherence of a nation state sort of territorial claims and maritime claims as something that is always already coherent.
What you're all making me think is, how come we have not mentioned the ubiquitous and perhaps too iconic Benjamin? He's so much, I mean, his view of translation as this
Yeah.
perfect thing that you're always striving for, but will never get to. Endless afterlives, none of which is privileged by birth order. It really, I don't know, maybe it's silly to return to him, but I keep thinking, oh, Brian did do Übersetzen. So you had at least sort of a linguistic reference to the language that he writes in. But that's
Yeah, let's do it.
one thing I wish we could bring him in somehow. And then the other thing I keep thinking for us in the future is the 1990s is definitely a period when all of you are some of the touchstones. So Glissant, Sakai, isn't that book the 1990s?
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
thinking of lambing. I kept
Yeah.
The Pleasures of Exile. I know you're not quite overtly saying that, but I did feel like that Evans, that film is really so much about embracing diaspora instead of the pseudo coherence of the nation or the forced coherence of the nation. It's something like that, and but that's something about the 90s and what was going on. Michelle Cliff, the Jamaican, she has, the Jamaican American writer, but has that book called Free Enterprise, which is so much like, reminds me of your poetry, Adrian. And it's a lot about translation in the Caribbean context. So that whole idea of that it's not Glissantian 1996 thought it's no accident that it's the Caribbean as the material place that this all comes from. And we're all saying that in so many ways. And the archipelago.
There's also something else that happens in the 90s, and Evan, you'll be familiar with this, which is the dissolution of the Association for Asian American Studies. There was something about, and I've been thinking about this too, and Evan, you saw this paper I gave at NYU in 2021 on the rise of origin, like American origin story, Asian American origin narratives as a sort of simulacrum for reparations, right? Because with the 80s you get Reagan, Bush the first, and
Right.
this is one of my mentors, Lisa Yoneyama's work, which is this is really the age of the reconciliation, the reparations kind of work, in the age that comes after the deferral of those the 50 years of the Cold War. And so what is it about these like sort of global geopolitical reorderings towards different new world orders that compel sort of this really like this age of fracture, right? This dissolution
Yes.
that happens both in Caribbean thought, but also literally the dissolution of Asian American studies by Filipino insurgents, right? Like calling out the neoliberalization of the Asian American subject in the 1990s. And so I think you're onto something with the 1990s being a pivotal moment for these sort of, if not reconfigurations, then reflections
Mhm.
on what we take for granted in the state of our, our various fields that we come from. So
That is great. I always feel like if you could create a space-time language line, a historical literary line, of the problem that we're looking at, you would get these flashpoint moments, again, to use a Benjaminian term, and they would somehow be revealing for us. When works are translated even could be another issue, or another part of that space-time language set of three-dimensionality.
Yeah, translation is like the work that does, like, what does Benjamin call it? The yet site, right? The time of the
That's
now,
great.
right? Like, but it's something that's compelled by aesthetic work. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
I will,
that's great.
I
Go
will
ahead.
comment here. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Susan.
No, go. You go.
Okay. I mean, just your invitation to think decade by decade, or think in decadal terms, reminds me of something that I've been thinking about with the way different decades have approached geography in terms of continents versus archipelagos. For instance, in the 1950s, we had the Asia-Africa Conference hosted, and so we're naming two continents, Asia and Africa, and it's being hosted in an anti-colonial way in the island nation of Indonesia, on an island. This is not just anti-colonial. It's watching in real time an island nation say something like this. There's something to that notion of the continent wherein is power. And then we fast forward to the 1960s, and in Cuba, we have the hosting of the tricontinental. And so Cuba is now saying, look, two continents wasn't good enough for one island. Now we will have three continents converge on one island. It's a way of Cuba saying, we now are part of the continent of America. It's consistent with calls that you get in the 1960s in the Caribbean we need to continentalize. But I think what we see in the 1990s is the decolonization was happening via these metaphors, these continental metaphors. And so we had decolonization of land, decolonization of the mind. But what we had is a continuously continentalized mind. In the 1990s, we come to a decade where we've got a version of decolonization already having transpired. But what we get with the 1990s is the question of decontinentalization. Glissant saying Europe is decontinentalizing, Europe is archipelagizing, and North America is archipelagizing. And so 50s and 60s, islands trying to continentalize. 1990s, islands looking at the continents and saying, no, we embrace what an archipelago is. And in fact, let you continental people now feel fear and self-loathing because you are turning into archipelagos.
Can I grasp at something also that like let's just keep going with the 1990s.
Oh, I love this, you guys.
Like this is so I'm gonna bring in Evan's new project for a little bit because the way that you're thinking about like the like to historicize it, right? Like the turn from third world to global south is it's the
Mm,
post-Cold War turn, right? It's like we're thinking about these like really I think our conversation is in the tradition of the Lisa Yoneyama sort of questioning of in her book Cold War Ruins, right? On the trans-Pacific redress culture, I think she calls it, of the 80s and the 90s as well. Well, also you got NAFTA, right? You have a way in which, you know, you have NAFTA and hell, you have like early Apoderae, right? And transnationalization, right? And the scapes and just thinking about the ways that I think the post-Cold War moment not only sort of caused the dissolution of like the continental superiority of maybe the US, USSR sort of geopolitical imaginaries, but also the way that thinkers of different sorts in a different context had to reckon with a world that was now formally opening up to the unbridled sort of like neoliberal, you know, accelerated transit of capital. You've got NAFTA, which literally is the global southification of Mexico and Central and Latin America through the channeling of resources up north to the United States. You've got like the sort of like fractalization of what is ostensibly an American imperial relationship into one that now gets to be called global trade, whether through NAFTA or through the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was dissolved, right, like towards Trump. You've got NATO coming to stand in for the weakened UN, right? Like you have all these new sort of geopolitical blocks emerging that are also emerging out of both capital flows and military and securitization flows. And so that 90s moment, that pre 9/11 post Cold War moment,
yeah.
right? I really think we just got to probe it a little bit. I really
Yeah,
like what this
that's what, yeah, exactly what I was going to say, Adrian, is that it is kind of a post, Berlin Wall
right.
moment. So just to think about the Vietnam context, right, this is kind of the inflection point in which Vietnam, has this identity of the kind of anti-colonial movement. And it's kind of like the political vigor of that. And then the fall of the Soviet bloc, there is a very like strong neoliberal turn with the kind of economic neoliberalization, the doing by, economic policies. But this is the same time that they are then establishing diplomatic relations with the US, right? So there's this whole like the past is the past, that Cold War order is the past. The 1990s is also the same time that Vietnam will flip is a strong word, but of course, during the Third World Liberation Movement, there's strong Vietnam-Palestine ties. And the 1990s is when they established diplomatic relations with Israel as well. So it's the same kind of moment. It's also when they established diplomatic relations with South Korea, which like during the Cold War order, it was a no-no. They aligned with North Korea. But now there's this recognition that, South Korea is a strong kind of Asian capitalist partner. We want to be South Korea and have this kind of Asian economic miracle. So there is a kind of papering over of these kind of Cold War antagonisms and a kind of emphasis on this kind of idea of globalization, like as you mentioned, that is very much routed through kind of capital in a new kind of emerging neoliberal world order.
You're making me think, in addition, I mean, this, where, we may be, now just free associating, but C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins was reissued in the 1960s. And so there's something there about as another location for this, rethinking of the Caribbean continental archipelagic space, what Brian is talking about, decontinentalizing as a fixed part of decolonization until later. It's only unfixed after, but it's something like a part of the trajectory. What else did I? There's something here. Brian's way of talking about it is decades. You know how we made centuries problematic, that the long 18th century, etc. So we've dropped that one, but decades would be another one. where that kind of thinking gives you these little units of time that they're arbitrary. And so you can do something with them. But so your whole idea of decade thinking is it's another thing that I feel like we're doing in terms of different temporalities. And then pre and post, and how long are those?
I'll just interject that I am enthusiastic about spending more time with Adrian's poem on the hourglass in relation to the decade. Sorry to interrupt.
No, I think, and I keep thinking in Black Jacobins, there's something about grains. I think it's corn, but it's not unrelated to what you're talking about. He's talking about, James is talking about the different potential Black leaders and Biasu versus, I think, Toussaint. But anyway, it's the idea of the grains, the little part for the whole, the thing that's broken down, that maybe you keep broken, so I feel like your grains could work also with that, as thinking of the metaphors and the material realities of all of this work on, what archipelagic translation. Let's say that's kind of what we're doing or trying to do.
Can I just say also, I think I want to give a shout out to Cole Thrush. He's a historian at UBC. And he just finished a manuscript that I'm really excited about, and it's on sort of shipwrecks in the Pacific Northwest and like thinking about the failures of settler colonialism, like just offshore. But I think one of the ways that and I know that all of us, both as scholars but also as producers of book form projects, right? In a lot of ways, I think part of the turn we can make here is also just the way that Cole has structured his book is he is doing in this sort of dialectic way, right? So he's starting at the present, going way back to the past, and then the present, and he keeps it's literally he's structured, and he's a traditionally trained historian, but he's structuring his book on shipwrecks and the shoal and the shore as a sort of ebb and flow to try to advance a different way through which the model of our works themselves might also evoke and mimic the kind of critique we want to make. To speak on materiality, right? I think just really pragmatically, for the scholars and the students watching, this is also something that we can do in the commitment we have to creating the aesthetic form, which is even if it's a monograph, especially if it's a monograph, right? I think there's something that could be really evocative about doing the kind of archipelagic dialectic work in our writing practice as well, even if we have to relearn style.
I feel like I know what you mean, or my immediate reaction to that is, yes, writing in a way that will address or reach a broader audience, which we all want. And you're talking about it in perhaps a more lyrical way than just accessibility, which is one way to talk about it. But the shape of the poem on the page, I think we would all love if you would send the poem to us later.
I'm happy
could
to.
be part of and I might send just a little description of my book to you guys, because it's definitely doing this in a very different kind of setting. It's ways that the idea of the Mediterranean and the reality of the Mediterranean was translated to the New World by a variety of thinkers, from Alexander von Humboldt to James. And one of the writers, it does something that Evan was really doing with that wonderful think of Korea as being like the US South, shaped like. That was there's a Jamaican writer, W. Adolph Roberts, who writes novels on the Civil War, a romantic trilogy. And he has the idea, he has a book on the Caribbean, a set of essays where he does exactly that. The Caribbean is an upside down version of Greece. So, you really could do something with this unfixing of the maps, superimposing different ones on top of one another, not to create a perfect coherent whole, but the opposite. Sort of opacity of the superimposition, something like that. What, you know, just to use more of our terms.
I do have to run, but
Yeah,
thank you so much,
I think I
everyone,
do
for
too.
the
It's now,
conversation.
that was so great, you guys, you know,
Yeah.
all of us.
Yes,
Just a
I'm so glad that
wonderful
we can make
conversation.
this work. Yeah, yeah.
To my favorite salutation is to be continued. So you never have to end or leave people. To be continued. I mean, Brian and I are doing this work,
Mhm, mhm.
so we literally can do it.
And we're at the stage of putting together a call for abstracts, and so we would love it if we can send you this call for abstracts, and we would love to have you as participants in the project.
We really would. I'm going to get the film. I love.
Oh yeah, it's available on Vimeo.
I'm
So it's
sure it
easy
is.
to
It
access.
looks so.
Yeah.
It really looks. I mean, and I had no idea about that. The Vietnamese Israelis.
Mhm, mhm.
Okay.
Thank
Well, thank you
you.
so much. This has been wonderful.
Thank you.
That was
Thank you,
really
Erwin, as
terrific.
well. Yes, for staying with us, and thank you, everyone,
Thanks,
for
y'all.
Thank
tuning
you,
in.
Evan, for doing it.
Oh yes, of course.
And congrats to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care.
Bye all.